So I wanted to do something a little bit different. You guys have asked for Bigfoot, Sasquatch stories, but I wanted to give you something a little bit different than what you may see on other YouTube channels. I wanted to give you some historical accounts from old newspapers, and these date back to all the way back to like the mid 1800s. So, what I'm going to share with you today is actually a story that I found from 1840. It's really cool. It's one of the more compelling stories. So, I hope you enjoy. They're old accounts. And so the language that's used in the publication is a little bit different than how we speak. And I'm actually going to be sharing the stories in the original author's voice. So I'm not going to be changing the language or the dialect or any of that. I'm actually just going to share the article with you as it was originally written, because I think that's kind of cool. So the first one is called Wild Man of the Woods, and it was published in the Salt River Journal in February of 1840. And this actually was published originally in Missouri. And the article that I'm going to share was published or republished again in the Boston Times. Robert Lincoln Esquire, agent of the New York Lumber Company, has just returned from St. Peter's River, near the head of steamboat navigation on the upper Mississippi, bringing with him a living wild man of the woods with two small cubs, supposed to be 3 months old. Mr. Lincoln went out to the Northwest as an agent of the New York Lumber Company in July last with a view to establish mills on the pinelands near the Fall of St. Anthony, and he has given us a detail of the operations of the company and the circumstances which led to the capture of the extraordinary creature mentioned above. The company set out on their expedition in July last. The workmen and laborers, with the principal of the machinery, went by the way of New Orleans, and at that city they chartered a steamboat and proceeded up the Mississippi. The whole business was under the direction of Mr. Lincoln. They had on board all the necessary tools and saws, together with apparatus for gristmill horses, cows, a good stock of provisions, arms, ammunition. They passed directly up the river and reached St. Peter's in safety. During the winter, Mr. Lincoln and several of his workmen made frequent excursions in pursuit of game, which was very abundant, and their camp one continued scene of festivity. The Indians brought in large quantities of furs, which Mr. Lincoln purchased for a mere trifle, and lined his cabin throughout, which rendered his rude hut very warm and comfortable. About the 4th of January, 2 or 3 of the carpenters who had been out in pursuit of a gang of wolves that had proved very troublesome came into the camp and reported that they had seen a huge monster in the forest on the branch of the Mississippi, having the form of a man, but much taller and stouter, covered with long hair and of a frightful aspect. They stated that when seen, he was on a log, looking directly at them, and the moment they raised their muskets, he darted into the thicket and disappeared. They saw him again in about a half an hour, apparently watching them, and when they turned towards him, he again disappeared. Mr. Lincoln was first disposed to think lightly of the matter, believing that the men might be mistaken about the size and height of the object, or supposing it might have been a trick of the Indians to frighten them. He was informed, however, by some of the natives that such beings had often been seen in St. Peter's and near the falls on the Mississippi, and they proposed to guide a party of workmen to a bluff where it was thought that they might be found. The men were all ready for the adventure, and arming themselves with rifles and hunting knives, they started in pursuit under the direction of Mr. Lincoln and the Indian guides. On the way, they were joined by several of the natives, and the whole party numbered 23. They arrived at the bluff in the afternoon on the 21st day of January and encamped in a cave or grotto at the foot of the hill. Early next morning, 2 of the Indians who were sent out to reconnoiter in about an hour returned and said that they had seen the wild man on the other side of the hill. The whole party immediately prepared for the pursuit. Mr. Lincoln gave positive orders to the men not to fire on him unless it should be necessary in self-defense, as he wished to take him alive. The Indians stated that although a powerful creature, he was believed to be perfectly harmless, as he always fled at the approach of man. While Mr. Lincoln was giving his men the instructions, The wild man appeared in sight. The Indians had provided themselves with ropes prepared to catch wild horses, with which they hoped to ensnare and bind the creature without maiming him. The instant the company moved towards him, he sprang forward with a horrid and frightful yell, which made the forest ring. The Indians followed close upon him, and Lincoln and his men brought up the rear. The pursuit was continued nearly an hour, now gaining upon the object of their chase, and now losing sight of him. He finally darted into a thicket, and they were unable to find him. They then began to retrace their steps towards the place of encampment, and when within about a mile of the cavern, the wild man crossed their path within 20 rods. They immediately gave chase again and accidentally drove the creature from the forest to an open prairie. At length, he suddenly stopped and turned upon his pursuers. Mr. Lincoln was then in the advance. Fearing that he might attack them or return to the woods and escape, he fired upon him and lodged a charge of buckshot in the calf of his leg. He fell immediately, and the Indians sprang forward and threw their ropes over his head, arms, and legs, and with much effort succeeded in binding him fast. He struggled, however, most desperately, gnashed his teeth, and howled in a frightful manner. They then formed a sort of litter of branches and limbs of threes, and placing him on it, they carried him to the encampment. A watch was then placed over him, and every effort made that could be devised to keep him quiet, but he continued to howl piteously all night. Towards morning, two small cubs, about 3 feet high, and very similar to the larger monster, came into the camp and were taken without resistance. As soon as the monster saw them, he became furious, gnashing his teeth, and howled and thrashed about until he burst his cord and came very near effecting his escape. But he was bound anew, and after that was kept more carefully watched and guarded. Next day, he was placed on his litter and carried down to the mills of the St. Peter's. For 2 or 3 days, Mr. Lincoln says he refused to eat or drink or take any kind of food, but continued to howl at intervals, an hour at a time. At length, however, he began to eat, but from that time his howls ceased, and he remained sullen and stupid ever since. The cubs took food very rapidly and became quiet and playful. Mr. Lincoln is a native of Boston, and some of the workmen engaged in his mills are from this city. He arrived here on Sunday afternoon in the brig St. Charles, Stewart, master from New Orleans, with the wild man and 2 cubs, and they were all removed from the vessel that evening. By an invitation of Lincoln, who is an old acquaintance, we went down to his rooms to examine the monster. He is a horrid-looking creature and reminds us very strongly of the fabled satyrs, as we have pictured them to our own mind. He is about 8 feet 3 inches high when standing erect, and his frame is of a giant proportion in every part. His legs are not straight, but like those of any other 4-footed animal, and his whole body is covered with a hide very much like that of a cow. His arms are very large and long and ill proportioned. It does not appear from his manner that he ever walked on all 4s. The fingers and toes are mere branches armed with stout claws. His head is covered with thick, coarse black hair, like the mane of a horse. The appearance of his countenance, if such it may be called, is very disgusting, nay, almost horrible. It is covered with a thinner and lighter coat than the rest of the body. There is no appearance of eyebrows or nose. The mouth is very large and wide, and similar to that of a baboon. His eyes are quite dull and heavy, and there is no indication of cunning or activity about them. Mr. Lincoln says he is beyond doubt carnivorous, as he universally rejects bread and vegetables and eats flesh with great avidity. He thinks he is of the orangutan species, but from what we have seen, we are inclined to consider him a wild animal somewhat resembling a man. He is, to say the least, of the most extraordinary creatures ever brought before the public from any part of the earth or water under the earth, and we believe will prove a difficult puzzle to the scientific. He lies down like a brute and does not appear to possess more instinct than common domestic animals. He is now quite tame and quiet, and is confined with a stout chain attached to his legs. It is Mr. Lincoln's intention to submit these animals to the inspection of the scientific for a few days, in order to ascertain what they are, and after that to dispose of them to some person for exhibition. Mr. Lincoln himself will return to the St. Peter's in the course of 3 weeks. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. It is one of the more compelling near Sasquatch, near Bigfoot accounts that I was able to find. And this took place, in the mid 1800s. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment down below. If you haven't already subscribed, be sure to smash that subscribe button, share, and help this little channel grow. Thanks for stopping by.